Part 5. Baseline Elevation and Satisfaction. Ecosystems. Like the master gardener who moves beyond keeping plants alive toward creating comprehensive conditions where they naturally flourish year after year, you now approach the sophisticated work of elevating your baseline experience from adequate to genuinely satisfying through understanding the slow, steady rhythm of authentic contentment that emerges from thriving ecosystem conditions rather than depending on perfect external circumstances. You have traveled far in the garden of your becoming. Through conscious creation, you learned to bridge dreams with reality. Sacred stewardship taught you to honor life's resources as precious gifts. Intentional living wove wisdom into ordinary moments. Conscious personal growth and lifelong learning established your capacity for deliberate becoming throughout all life phases. Now comes perhaps the most transformative phase, systematic elevation of your baseline satisfaction from survival to thriving level. From managing difficulties to actively creating the internal and external ecosystem conditions where contentment emerges naturally through ordinary engagement with daily life, rather than requiring extraordinary circumstances or constant external achievements. This work represents the evolution from simple happiness techniques to sophisticated satisfaction architecture. Rather than pursuing temporary mood boosts that fade through adaptation, you will learn to create what researchers call satisfaction ecosystems. Multiple interconnected elements working together to support elevated baseline contentment through conscious variety, psychological richness, renewal cycles, and healthy social contexts that compound over time. The satisfaction ecosystem principle reveals that lasting contentment operates like a thriving garden, where multiple elements, soil conditions, plant diversity, beneficial relationships, appropriate seasons of growth and rest, work together to create conditions where natural flourishing becomes inevitable rather than dependent on perfect weather or constant intervention. Your baseline experience functions similarly. When you consciously cultivate the internal conditions, emotional regulation, meaning-making capacity, appreciation patterns, and external conditions, social relationships, environmental alignment, life structure, that support natural human flourishing, contentment emerges reliably through the compound effect of small daily investments rather than requiring dramatic life changes or perfect circumstances. Understanding the compound satisfaction principle proves essential for this work. Like the master gardener who knows that tiny daily improvements in soil quality, plant care, and garden ecosystem health create extraordinary transformation over seasons, baseline elevation emerges through small, consistent practices that build capacity rather than depending on maintaining specific external conditions. Contemporary neuroscience reveals that practices requiring less than 5 minutes daily, systematic appreciation, conscious breathing, brief loving-kindness meditation can create measurable baseline elevation within weeks that continues building throughout months of consistent practice. The key lies not in individual techniques, but in their cumulative effects on your nervous system, thought patterns, social relationships, and life infrastructure. Through comprehensive exploration, you will discover how accurate baseline assessment reveals your unique satisfaction patterns and cultivation opportunities, how evidence-based practices from positive psychology create sustainable elevation rather than temporary enhancement, how self-compassion and neuroplasticity awareness provide the emotional and scientific foundation for lasting change, and how flow-state cultivation transforms routine activities into intrinsically satisfying experiences. Most importantly, you will learn the advanced baseline elevation strategies that prevent hedonic adaptation, cultivate psychological richness, create renewal systems, and recalibrate social comparisons, creating your personal satisfaction ecosystem where elevated contentment becomes sustainable lifestyle rather than temporary improvement that requires constant maintenance. This systematic approach to baseline elevation creates internal resources that support flourishing during both favorable and challenging circumstances, while maintaining appropriate engagement with authentic goals and relationships that serve purposes larger than individual comfort. The foundation you establish here will enable the meaningful contribution work of Part 6, where stable contentment provides the generous capacity necessary for sustainable service to collective well-being. Your satisfaction develops like rings of ancient trees, accumulating slowly through countless small additions that create strength, stability, and resilience. Each conscious practice contributes essential substance to your capacity for enduring contentment that serves both personal flourishing and the larger purposes toward which authentic satisfaction naturally tends when approached with wisdom, patience, and commitment to systematic cultivation rather than random improvement efforts. Reaching toward the light, understanding and measuring your satisfaction. Baseline. The young oak does not waste energy lamenting its current height, but turns its entire being toward the light above, growing stronger roots to support taller branches, reaching season after season toward the canopy where its leaves will dance in full sunlight and its acorns will ripen into abundance that nourishes the forest for generations. Stand in any garden at dawn and witness one of nature's most profound demonstrations of baseline elevation in action. As the first rays of morning light touch the earth, every green leaf turns toward the sun with an urgency that speaks to the deepest intelligence of life itself. The sunflower bud tracks across the sky, the tomato vines stretch their growing tips toward brightness. The mighty oak extends its highest branches another inch closer to the canopy where full photosynthesis becomes possible. This reaching toward light represents something far more sophisticated than simple growth. Each plant is actively elevating its baseline capacity for thriving by positioning itself to receive maximum nourishment. The oak does not grow randomly in all directions, hoping accidentally to find light. Instead, it systematically develops the infrastructure needed to capture sunlight at ever higher levels, building stronger root systems to support taller branches, developing broader leaf surfaces to maximize photosynthesis, and strategically placing its fruit-bearing branches where optimal light creates the sweetest acorns. Your satisfaction operates according to these same principles of systematic elevation toward optimal conditions for flourishing. Just as plants naturally reach toward light, your consciousness can learn to orient systematically toward the thoughts, practices, and life arrangements that elevate your baseline experience from surviving to thriving, from managing difficulties to actively cultivating conditions where contentment emerges naturally through ordinary engagement with life. But unlike the plant kingdom, human beings often spend years reaching in directions that cannot provide sustainable nourishment, pursuing satisfaction strategies that create temporary peaks followed by return to previous baseline levels, or attempting to force elevation through approaches that work against rather than with the natural principles that govern lasting contentment. Understanding these principles transforms satisfaction from something that happens to you into something you actively cultivate through conscious choices that compound over time like seasons of growth that gradually elevate a sapling into a mighty tree whose fruit nourishes not only itself, but the entire ecosystem surrounding it. The hidden architecture of lasting satisfaction. Imagine discovering that your baseline contentment operates like a young tree's growth toward light, with infinite potential for elevation through systematic, patient cultivation of the right conditions. Most people never realize that their daily satisfaction level represents not a fixed personality trait or inevitable result of circumstances, but rather the current height their consciousness has reached in its natural growth toward optimal flourishing. Research in positive psychology has revealed something extraordinary about how lasting satisfaction actually develops. Your baseline experience, which represents the quality of routine moments that comprise 90% of lived experience, can be systematically elevated through practices that work with rather than against the natural principles governing human flourishing. This represents a profound shift from pursuing temporary happiness boosts to cultivating the underlying capacity for sustained contentment. The distinction proves crucial for anyone serious about lasting satisfaction enhancement. Consider two approaches to feeling better. You could pursue exciting experiences, achievements, or favorable circumstances that create temporary satisfaction spikes, much like a plant trying to gather scattered sunlight from whatever random direction it appears. Or you could systematically cultivate the internal and external conditions that enable your natural capacity for contentment to flourish consistently, like a tree strategically growing toward reliable light sources that provide sustained nourishment. Contemporary happiness research has documented a phenomenon called the hedonic treadmill, which explains why most satisfaction enhancement efforts fail to create lasting elevation. When people pursue external improvements, such as income increases, relationship changes, or lifestyle upgrades, they typically experience temporary satisfaction boosts followed by adaptation back to previous baseline levels within months or even weeks. The lottery winner returns to baseline happiness despite wealth. The person who moves to their dream location finds their satisfaction levels stabilizing at familiar patterns despite dramatically improved surroundings. Initially, this research suggested that happiness levels remain essentially fixed regardless of life changes, leading some to conclude that pursuing better circumstances is futile. However, subsequent studies have revealed something crucial that early research missed. Not all satisfaction enhancement approaches trigger hedonic adaptation. Interventions that build internal capacity rather than depending on external conditions can create lasting baseline elevation that resists adaptation. The difference lies in understanding satisfaction as infrastructure rather than outcome. Like a tree that develops stronger roots and taller branches to capture light more effectively over time, practices that build your capacity for contentment create cumulative benefits that compound across years rather than fading through adaptation. Skills for emotional regulation, perspectives that find meaning in ordinary experience, habits that align daily choices with deeper values, and neural patterns that naturally orient toward appreciation create structural changes in your capacity for flourishing that external circumstances cannot provide or take away. The biology of baseline elevation. Your body and brain maintain sophisticated biological systems that directly influence your baseline capacity for satisfaction and resilience. Understanding these systems reveals why certain approaches to contentment, cultivation, create lasting changes while others provide only temporary improvement, and how systematic elevation practices work with your biology rather than against it. Research on allostatic load demonstrates how chronic stress patterns gradually undermine baseline well-being through measurable changes in hormonal, immune, and neurological function. When your system remains persistently activated by ongoing stressors, perceived threats, or negative thought patterns, this creates cumulative biological wear that manifests as reduced energy, compromised mood regulation, decreased cognitive clarity, and diminished capacity for experiencing routine pleasures. Like a tree trying to grow in perpetually harsh conditions, your natural flourishing capacity becomes constrained by biological adaptations to chronic challenge. Conversely, practices that promote recovery, positive emotional states, and parasympathetic nervous system activation can gradually restore optimal baseline functioning through beneficial biological changes that accumulate over time. Research on meditation practitioners shows measurable improvements in cortisol regulation, immune function, and neuroplasticity after just 8 weeks of consistent practice. Studies of gratitude interventions demonstrate changes in neurotransmitter production and brain activation patterns that enhance baseline mood and life satisfaction. The neuroplasticity revolution in neuroscience provides hope for anyone wondering whether baseline satisfaction can truly be elevated, regardless of age or previous experience. Your brain maintains the capacity to form new neural pathways and strengthen beneficial patterns throughout your entire lifespan. Each time you consciously choose appreciation over complaint, respond to difficulty with self-compassion rather than self-criticism, or engage in activities that generate intrinsic satisfaction, you strengthen neural networks that make these positive responses increasingly automatic and natural. Like a tree that develops more efficient vascular systems to transport nutrients to higher branches, your nervous system can develop more efficient pathways for accessing contentment, processing challenges skillfully, and maintaining emotional equilibrium during both routine and difficult circumstances. The biological infrastructure for flourishing can be systematically cultivated through practices that honor how your body and brain actually function rather than working against these systems. The mathematics of compound satisfaction. Research on habit formation and behavioral change reveals something remarkable about how small, consistent improvements accumulate over time to to create transformations that seem impossible to achieve through dramatic efforts alone. While individual satisfaction enhancement practices may seem modest in their immediate impact, their compound effects over months and years can create extraordinary baseline elevation that fundamentally transforms your relationship with daily life. Mathematical modeling illustrates the theoretical potential of incremental improvement approaches. If someone could improve their baseline satisfaction by just 1% each day through simple, sustainable practices, this would create approximately 37-fold enhancement over 1 year, 1.01 raised to the 365th power. While this represents mathematical potential rather than a literal prescription, it demonstrates how small, consistent changes might accumulate into significant baseline improvements over time when approaches resist adaptation and build lasting capacity. Research supports the compound principle through studies of specific practices. A landmark study by Sonia Lubomirsky found that people who wrote 3 things they were grateful for each day showed significant increases in life satisfaction that persisted for months beyond the intervention period. The practice itself required less than 5 minutes daily, yet its cumulative effects created measurable baseline elevation. Studies of loving-kindness meditation show similar compound benefits, with practitioners developing increased positive emotions, life satisfaction, and social connectedness that build over time rather than fading through adaptation. The compound satisfaction principle explains why many people struggle with contentment, cultivation despite good intentions. They attempt dramatic changes that require unsustainable effort, create temporary improvements that fade quickly, or pursue approaches that work against rather than with the natural accumulation processes that govern lasting satisfaction enhancement. Like trying to force a tree to grow faster by pulling on its branches, these efforts often create stress rather than sustainable elevation. Effective baseline cultivation works more like providing optimal growing conditions that enable natural development. When you align daily practices with the biological and psychological principles that govern human flourishing, small improvements accumulate naturally into significant transformation over time. The key involves selecting approaches that build capacity rather than depending on maintaining specific external conditions, creating positive cycles that strengthen rather than exhaust your resources. Imagine discovering that 15 minutes of morning sunlight exposure, 3 expressions of appreciation throughout your day, and 10 minutes of evening reflection could create measurable baseline elevation within weeks that continues building throughout months of consistent practice. The compound potential lies not in the individual practices, but in their accumulative effects on your nervous system, thought patterns, and life infrastructure. Mapping your current baseline landscape before a gardener plants new growth, they study the existing soil conditions, sunlight patterns, and drainage characteristics that will determine what can flourish in their particular environment. Similarly, effective baseline elevation requires accurate understanding of your current satisfaction patterns, like mapping the height your contentment tree has already reached and identifying the conditions that currently support or constrain its continued growth toward an optimal flourishing. Most people have surprisingly limited awareness of their actual baseline experience because consciousness naturally focuses on dramatic peaks and valleys while missing the subtle patterns that determine overall life satisfaction. You might clearly remember last month's celebration or recent frustration while having little accurate sense of your routine morning mood, typical afternoon energy levels, or general satisfaction during ordinary work tasks that comprise the majority of your conscious experience. The distinction between baseline and peak experiences proves crucial for effective elevation work. Peak experiences represent the exceptional moments that stand out from ordinary patterns, celebrations, achievements, adventures, breakthroughs, intense pleasures. These peaks capture attention precisely because they differ significantly from baseline reality. Yet research suggests they may contribute less to overall life satisfaction than the quality of routine moments that occur during everyday activities. Baseline experience encompasses your typical satisfaction during mundane activities that comprise 85–90% of conscious experience. How you generally feel during morning preparations, your standard energy levels during ordinary work, your usual mood during routine conversations. your typical response patterns to minor frustrations, or daily transitions. Experience sampling studies that randomly assess people's emotional states during normal activities suggest that baseline experience quality predicts overall life satisfaction more accurately than peak experience frequency. Consider how revolutionary this insight could be for your contentment cultivation. Instead of organizing your satisfaction strategy around pursuing more peak experiences, imagine systematically elevating the quality of ordinary moments through practices that enhance your baseline capacity for finding meaning, appreciation, and intrinsic satisfaction during routine activities. Like a tree that develops the ability to photosynthesize more efficiently, enabling it to thrive even during periods when conditions are merely adequate rather than optimal. Understanding your current baseline requires temporarily setting aside aspirations for improvement and simply observing your actual patterns with curious, compassionate attention. This assessment becomes the foundation for all elevation work that follows, revealing which aspects of your satisfaction and infrastructure already provide strong support and which areas need cultivation to support higher levels of sustained contentment. Practical baseline assessment. Understanding your growth potential. Effective measurement requires approximately 2 weeks of gentle observation because shorter periods may capture temporary circumstances rather than stable patterns, while longer tracking often becomes burdensome and abandoned before revealing useful insights. The goal involves developing accurate understanding of current patterns rather than immediate improvement, though awareness itself often catalyzes positive changes. Week 1 Prompt. Foundation Pattern Recognition. Each evening, spend 5 minutes quietly reflecting on your satisfaction across key areas that influence baseline experience. Rather than rating with numbers, simply notice and briefly note patterns using whatever language feels natural and honest. Physical foundation encompasses your energy levels, sleep quality, physical comfort, and vitality during routine activities. Notice whether your body generally supports or constrains your capacity for engaging positively with daily life. How often does physical discomfort, fatigue, or health concerns affect your overall satisfaction during ordinary moments? Mental infrastructure includes your typical clarity, focus, emotional regulation, and stress management during normal circumstances. Observe your mind's general tendency toward worry, appreciation, problem solving, or rumination during routine activities. Notice whether your thought patterns generally enhance or diminish your baseline experience throughout ordinary days. Relationship quality encompasses your satisfaction with connection, support, communication, and social interaction during typical encounters. Consider whether your relationships generally provide energy and meaning or create drain and complexity that affects your baseline contentment during both social and solitary time. Environmental alignment involves how well your physical spaces, work situation, and daily routines support or constrain your natural capacity for flourishing. Notice whether your surroundings generally enhance your mood and energy or create subtle stress that affects your baseline experience throughout typical days. During this week, pay particular attention to which activities, interactions, or circumstances reliably enhance your baseline satisfaction versus those that create temporary excitement followed by return to previous levels. Begin noticing the difference between authentic nourishment and stimulation that requires constant renewal to maintain its effects. Week 2, Peak versus Baseline Analysis. Continue gentle observation while adding specific attention to how your satisfaction actually functions throughout typical days. Track which experiences provide sustained satisfaction enhancement versus those that create temporary peaks followed by baseline return or even satisfaction debt that leaves you depleted. Notice your adaptation patterns by observing how quickly positive changes lose their satisfaction impact. Do environmental improvements maintain their effect over time or fade into invisible background? Do achievement satisfactions provide lasting enhancement or brief spikes that leave you searching for the next accomplishment? Do purchased items or experiences continue providing satisfaction or require replacement with new acquisitions to maintain positive effects? Identify what percentage of your current contentment depends on external circumstances, achievements, or special experiences versus internal capacities for finding satisfaction during ordinary moments. Consider whether your satisfaction strategy relies primarily on pursuing peak experiences or cultivating baseline elevation that provides consistent foundation regardless of circumstances. Begin noticing which approaches to feeling better actually build your capacity for sustained contentment versus those that provide temporary relief or distraction that requires constant maintenance. Like distinguishing between practices that help a tree develop stronger root systems versus those that provide temporary support but don't enhance long-term structural integrity. Pay attention to correlation patterns between different areas of your life. Does physical vitality consistently enhance mental clarity and relationship satisfaction? Do environmental stressors systematically undermine multiple areas? Do certain practices create benefits that extend beyond their immediate focus? These correlations reveal leverage points where improvement in one area might create benefits throughout your entire satisfaction ecosystem. Understanding your satisfaction, tree's current height. Your 2 weeks of observation reveal your personal baseline pattern, like examining a tree's current height and branch structure to understand its growth potential and the conditions that would best support continued elevation. Some people discover they have strong satisfaction infrastructure in certain areas, like deep roots and sturdy lower branches that provide stable foundation for continued upward growth. Others reveal thinner infrastructure indicating areas where consistent stress, negative thought patterns, or environmental misalignment have constrained satisfaction capacity despite conscious efforts at improvement. Most people find mixed patterns, strength in some life domains combined with persistent limitations in others that prevent their overall satisfaction capacity from reaching its natural potential. This mixed pattern reveals both celebration-worthy capacities and specific cultivation opportunities where focused attention could create significant baseline elevation. The assessment often reveals surprising insights about satisfaction sources that contradict common assumptions. You might discover that carefully planned weekend adventures provide less sustained satisfaction than simple morning routines that create positive momentum for entire days. Or that your primary contentment actually emerges from mundane work activities, rather than the relationship or living situation you assumed was most important for your happiness. These insights create foundation for everything that follows in your baseline elevation journey. Unlike generic improvement approaches that attempt to enhance satisfaction without understanding individual patterns, your personal assessment reveals which specific practices are most likely to create sustainable elevation rather than temporary enhancement that fades through adaptation. Understanding your current baseline then also provides realistic expectations for the elevation work ahead. Some people discover they need focused attention on thought pattern cultivation. Others reveal environmental changes that would dramatically support their natural flourishing capacity. Still others find that their primary opportunity lies in developing better practices for emotional regulation or social connection. The architecture of upward growth. Your satisfaction assessment reveals not only where you currently stand, but also the natural direction your contentment wants to grow. Like understanding which way a tree leans toward light and how to support its continued reaching toward optimal conditions for flourishing. This understanding transforms baseline elevation from generic self-improvement into specific, personalized cultivation that honors your unique patterns while working with rather than against your natural development. The patterns you've discovered will guide everything that follows in Part 5 of your contentment journey. Your assessment reveals which internal thought patterns consistently drain energy from your baseline satisfaction, like diseased branches that require careful pruning to redirect life force toward healthy growth. It also identifies which external circumstances systematically undermine your natural capacity for flourishing, like environmental conditions, that constrain a tree's upward development regardless of its inherent potential. Just as a skilled arborist studies a tree's current condition before deciding which branches to prune and which growth to encourage, your satisfaction assessment provides the diagnostic information needed for effective intervention. You cannot skillfully remove obstacles you haven't clearly identified, cannot heal patterns you don't recognize, and cannot build upon foundations you have never examined. The measurement process often reveals that your biggest baseline enhancement opportunities come not from major life changes, but from simple daily practices that create positive momentum, like ensuring adequate morning light exposure supports your natural circadian rhythms, or developing evening routines that process daily experiences constructively rather than carrying stress into sleep. These discoveries prevent the common mistake of pursuing dramatic external changes while overlooking the readily available improvements that could create immediate and lasting satisfaction, elevation. Your unique baseline assessment also guides the selection of elevation practices most likely to create compound benefits rather than short-term improvements that fade through adaptation. Unlike pursuing peak experiences that provide temporary satisfaction spikes, systematic baseline cultivation works like providing optimal growing conditions that enable natural development toward your highest potential for sustained contentment. Understanding your satisfaction tree's current architecture creates realistic hope for continued growth. Like recognizing that a young oak has unlimited potential for reaching toward light when provided with appropriate conditions, your baseline assessment reveals both your current capacity and the natural direction your contentment wants to develop through conscious cultivation practices that support rather than force elevation. The elevation work ahead builds systematically on this foundation you've established, like adding new growth to existing branches rather than attempting to transplant yourself into entirely different soil. Each subsequent practice in Part 5 will honor the wisdom you've gained about your unique patterns while providing specific tools for cultivating the baseline satisfaction that enables contentment to emerge naturally through ordinary engagement with your actual life circumstances. Imagine looking back a year from now to recognize how this assessment became the beginning of your satisfaction tree's most significant growth period, when you learn to reach systematically toward the light of practices that nourish sustained contentment rather than pursuing the scattered sunshine of temporary improvements that leave you constantly searching for the next source of satisfaction. The foundation is established. The growing season begins now.